Austin Root is here for you, your favorite Australia guy.
Australia exports $150 billion in food every year. But here's the thing, almost all of it goes to just 12 countries. China buys roughly $20 billion. Japan buys roughly $5 billion. South Korea, Indonesia, Vietnam, India, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Philippines, and a few others make up the rest. That concentration sounds efficient, but it's actually a risk bomb waiting to explode. Because if any single country stops buying, due to geopolitics, climate, or competition, the entire supply chain fractures. And the 12 countries importing Australian food have no backup plan. In the next 18 minutes, I'm going to show you how Australia became the grocery store for 12 nations, why that seemed like a good idea at the time, and why the system is now dangerously fragile. But wait, before we begin, please subscribe to ensure that you never miss out on any of my essential stuff. Comment "I subscribe" below, and I will personally welcome you to our community. With that said, let's get started. Let's start with which countries we are actually talking about. China is the biggest. It imports about $20 billion in Australian food annually: beef, dairy, grains, seafood. China's population is 1.4 billion. It can't produce enough food for itself, so it buys from Australia. Japan imports roughly $5 billion, and here's the key detail. Japan sources about 60% of its beef from Australia. 60%. Not some. Most. If Australian beef stopped flowing, Japanese beef prices would spike dramatically. South Korea is similar. It sources about 40% of its beef from Australia. So does Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia buys roughly $3 billion in Australian livestock, grains, and dairy annually. The UAE is similar. Both Gulf states have minimal agricultural capacity, so they import almost everything. Indonesia and Vietnam, rapidly growing populations, limited agricultural land. They import Australian grains, oils, and some livestock. India is more complex. India is a net exporter of food, but it imports specific categories from Australia: grains, oils, specialty products. When India's domestic production fails, it buys from Australia. The Philippines, Bangladesh, and a few smaller countries round out the list. Each has specific dependencies: grains, dairy, beef, oils, all flowing from Australia because Australia has surplus and capacity. Here's the pattern. Countries with large populations, limited land, or vulnerable agriculture depend on Australian food as a buffer against domestic shortfalls. That dependency seems stable until you look at what's actually keeping it in place. Australia didn't plan to be the food exporter for Asia. It happened because three conditions aligned: geography, stability, and surplus. Geography first. Australia is close to Asia. Shipping Australian beef to Japan is faster and cheaper than shipping from Brazil or Argentina. The distance matters. For perishable goods, every day counts. Every dollar of shipping cost matters. Stability second. Australia is politically stable, has reliable rule of law, and trade agreements in place. Countries buying food need to know the supply will be consistent. Australia's political system, unlike some neighbors, makes that assumption reasonable. Surplus third. Australia has enormous agricultural capacity. It has water, land, and climate suitable for year-round production. It produces far more than it can consume domestically. So the surplus gets exported. These three conditions made Australia the natural choice for Asia. Not because Australian food is the best. It's not. But because it's nearby, reliable, and available. That's important to understand because it means the advantage isn't based on quality or efficiency. It's based on geography and stability. And those can change. Now let's talk about the biggest customer. China buys roughly $20 billion in Australian food every year. That's about 13% of Australia's total exports. For a single country buying food from a single trading partner, that's enormous concentration. And China has weaponized that relationship before. From 2020 to 2023, China imposed tariffs on Australian barley, wine, beef, and other products as political punishment for Australia's alignment with the US on COVID investigations and technology restrictions. These weren't trade disputes. They were political leverage disguised as tariffs. Australian barley exports to China fell from about $600 million per year to nearly zero. Wine exports collapsed. Beef exports were restricted. China was retaliating against unfair trade practices. It was demonstrating that it could cut off Australian food as punishment. The tariffs have mostly been removed, but the imports haven't fully recovered. And the lesson is clear: China can weaponize food trade. Australia has no defense against it because Australia has no alternative large buyer for that volume. This is power asymmetry. China can decide to stop buying. Australia cannot decide to stop selling because the revenue is too important. That's the China problem. And it exists at a scale where a dispute with one country threatens Australia's entire export economy. You might think, why doesn't Australia just sell to other countries? Because the infrastructure doesn't exist. The supply chains, the trade agreements, the shipping routes, the cold storage facilities, they are all optimized for the current 12 countries. Australian beef is processed in certain ways to meet Japanese standards. Australian grain is containerized and shipped through ports optimized for Asian routes. Trade agreements set specific quotas and tariffs for specific countries. All of this was built for the existing customer base. If Australia wanted to shift exports to, say, the European Union, it would require new processing facilities designed for EU standards, different shipping routes and ports, new trade negotiations, rebuilding supply chains that took decades to establish. That takes years. It takes capital. And in the meantime, it disrupts relationships with the existing 12 customers. So Australia isn't trapped by choice. It's trapped by infrastructure. The same infrastructure that made the current system work makes it nearly impossible to change quickly. Here's the thing about Australian agriculture. It depends on water. Australia has experienced multiple droughts in the last decade. From 2017 to 2019, drought reduced Australian grain exports by roughly 40%. Recent droughts in Queensland and New South Wales have created supply shocks. And climate projections suggest this is going to get worse, not better. Climate change is increasing weather variability. Years of abundant rainfall followed by severe droughts. It's already happening. So here's a scenario. Australia has a major drought. Grain production falls 30, 40, maybe 50%. At the same time, all 12 of the importing countries face potential supply shocks. What happens? Prices spike. Food inflation hits all 12 countries simultaneously. Japan, South Korea, and Saudi Arabia suddenly face meat shortages. Bangladesh and Indonesia face grain shortages. The supply chain is suddenly fragile for everyone. This isn't hypothetical. The conditions for this are present right now. Australia is in climate variability, and the importing countries have optimized their food security around steady Australian supply. That's a vulnerability that's very real. And it gets worse, because Australia isn't the only food exporter competing for Asia's attention. India is massively expanding agricultural capacity. India is building grain reserves and increasing exports to Southeast Asia. India's rice is cheaper than Australian rice. India's grain is closer to Southeast Asian markets than Australian grain. Brazil is expanding beef production and aggressively competing for Asian markets. Brazilian beef is often cheaper than Australian beef because Brazil has lower labor costs and more land. Argentina is developing new port infrastructure specifically to compete in Pacific trade. Argentina is positioning itself as an alternative exporter to Asia. These aren't marginal competitors. India produces more food than Australia. Brazil produces more beef than Australia. They are starting to compete directly for the same customers Australia has been serving. So Australia's comfortable market position is being eroded, not dramatically, not overnight, but measurably. Customers are starting to have choices. And when customers have choices, Australia's advantages, geographic proximity and stability, matter less. Price and capacity matter more. Here's something Australia probably doesn't want to hear. Several of the 12 countries importing its food are explicitly trying to stop doing so. India is building massive grain reserves and investing in agricultural self-sufficiency as a strategic priority. Vietnam is expanding rice production. Indonesia is expanding agricultural output and reducing import dependence. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are investing in food technology and local production capacity, vertical farms, aquaculture, advanced irrigation. These countries aren't secretly planning to keep buying from Australia forever. They're using Australian imports as a bridge while they build domestic capacity. Once that capacity is built, they'll reduce imports. This is rational strategy for them. Food security is national security. No country wants to depend on another country for food. So they're reducing that dependence deliberately, which means Australia's customer base is actively planning to shrink. That's the really uncomfortable part. Australia is selling to countries that are trying to stop buying. And then there's the price problem. Australian food exports are mostly commodities. Wheat, beef, barley, dairy. These are undifferentiated goods traded on global commodity markets. The price is set globally, not by Australia. When wheat prices fall, Australia's export value falls. When beef prices decline, Australian beef exporters make less money. Australia has no pricing power because the product is undifferentiated. This matters because it means Australia's export revenue is vulnerable to global commodity price declines. If global wheat prices fall 20%, Australian wheat exporters lose 20% of revenue, regardless of how efficiently they operate. And commodity prices are declining. Wheat is down 30% since 2022. Beef prices have been volatile. Dairy prices are subject to global supply shifts. So Australia is exporting more volume, but making less revenue per unit. And if prices decline further, the entire export business becomes less profitable. That creates pressure to increase volume to compensate, which means more concentration on existing customers, not diversification. Here's a scenario that actually threatens the system. Multiple pressures align simultaneously. A severe drought in Australia reduces grain and beef exports by 40%. China, whether for geopolitical or economic reasons, decides to source more beef from Brazil or India, reducing Australian imports by 30%. A shipping crisis, like 2020 to 2021, disrupts routes to Japan and South Korea. And global commodity prices fall because Brazil and Argentina are increasing supply, pushing Australian beef prices down further. In that scenario, Australia's food export revenue doesn't fall 10%. It falls 40, 50, maybe 60%. The entire export structure is under pressure. And Australia has no redundancy. It can't shift to other customers because the infrastructure isn't there. It can't maintain prices because commodities are price takers. It can't control demand because customers actively reducing dependence. This isn't doomsaying. It's recognizing that the system has multiple pressure points, and they could align. The question isn't whether this could happen. It's when. But here's the thing. Australia isn't the only one at risk. The 12 importing countries have designed their food security around steady Australian supply. If Australia fails them, they have no backup plan. Japan sources 60% of its beef from Australia. If Australian beef supply drops 40% due to drought or geopolitical disruption, where does Japan get the other 60%? It doesn't have time to build relationships with Brazil or Argentina. It doesn't have alternative suppliers ready to fill the gap. So if Australian supply is disrupted, Japanese meat prices spike immediately. Food inflation hits Japan fast. Saudi Arabia and the UAE depend on Australian grain for bread and livestock feed. If that supply is disrupted, they face immediate shortages. They are net importers of food with minimal domestic production. They are vulnerable. Bangladesh and Indonesia, food importing countries with large populations facing food security challenges. If Australian supply drops, they face inflation and potential supply shortages. So the concentration risk exists on both sides. Australia is concentrated in 12 customers. Those 12 customers are concentrated on Australian supply. If the relationship breaks, both sides are suddenly vulnerable. This is the core tension. Australia's agricultural success created food export dominance. That dominance created dependency, both Australia's dependence on customers and customers' dependence on Australia. That dependency seemed stable as long as nothing changed. But everything's changing. Climate is becoming more variable. Competition is increasing. Customers are reducing import dependence. Geopolitics is fragmenting. Commodity prices are volatile. Australia's strength, being a reliable exporter to 12 countries, becomes its vulnerability when any of those conditions shift. The system is optimized for stability, but that optimization makes it fragile. All the advantages Australia built, geographic proximity, political stability, abundant surplus, only work if the customers keep buying and the climate keeps cooperating. If either of those change, the advantages evaporate, and both are changing right now. So what can Australia actually do? Option 1. Diversify exports to new customers. This requires new infrastructure, new trade agreements, new supply chains. It's expensive, takes years, and disrupts existing relationships. Australia probably won't do this proactively. Option 2. Increase prices to extract more value per unit. This is risky because it risks losing market share to cheaper competitors like Brazil and India. Australia probably won't do this unless forced. Option 3. Invest in climate resilience, water management, drought-resistant crops, advanced irrigation. This is capital-intensive and expensive. Australia is doing some of this, but not at the scale required. Option 4. Accept the concentration and vulnerability. Do nothing proactive. Hope that the system holds until it breaks. Then deal with the crisis. Australia is likely to pursue incremental moves along options 3 and 4 while hoping something else changes. But none of these options are fast or cost-free, which means Australia is likely to face a crisis before it transforms its system. Here's the reality. Australia is the food exporter for 12 countries. That gives Australia power, but it also creates fragility. The system will break when multiple pressures align. A climate crisis, a geopolitical disruption, and changing customer preferences all hitting at once. And the conditions for that break are present right now. The question isn't whether the system is stable. It's how much stress it can take before it breaks. So here's my final question. If Australia's food export system breaks, due to concentration, climate, or geopolitics, who loses more? Australia, which loses export revenue, or the 12 countries that suddenly can't feed themselves? And should Australia be building redundancy and diversification now, before the system is stressed? Or will it wait until forced to change by crisis? That's what I want to know. Leave that in the comments.